Yeah, okay, we're live. Hello, and welcome to Get Recc'd. I am your host, Louis Falgout.
And I am your other host, Stephen Falgout. Get Recc'd is our occasional podcast where every week I recommend something to Louis and Louis recommends something to me, and then we discuss what we thought of those recommendations.
Yeah, and today we are doing a bit of a theme. We've got the best of the 1980s, which, following our previous best of episode, is a little bit convoluted because it's not necessarily the best thing. It's just the best of that decade from one given medium in each of our opinions that we haven't already recommended. So, yeah, a couple layers removed there, but essentially the idea. So basically, the two things we're talking about today, either one of us thought was at least among the best of that decade, and yeah.
And we chose two things, not on purpose, but we chose two things that just so happened to be in the very latter half of the decade.
Yeah, the first half was worthless. That's our official opinion. So.
Yeah, exactly. Really, when they talk about the 1980s, they really talk about the years 1987 through 1989.
Yeah.
The rest of it is kind of just forgotten entirely. Honestly, I'm going to go out on a limb here. If we're being honest, like everything before 1987 is just complete trash, really.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I will say December 1986 kind of slapped.
Oh, that's true.
But other than that.
And we can't forget about like year 3 AD. Or
yeah, unrelated to the 80s conversation.
The common era,
but yeah,
one might say.
Year 3 was pretty cool. Yeah, but that was...
Yeah. But other than that, yeah, it's pretty much trash.
Okay, well, speaking of trash, we should get into what I recommended to you, Stephen, if that's okay.
Yes, let's.
So I recommended to Stephen the Pixies album Doolittle. This is the second album from seminal alternative rock band Pixies. Of course, alternative rock pretty much became a thing in the 80s, maybe the 70s, the 80s, for all intents and purposes anyway. And at that time, the term kind of had more meaning because a lot of these earlier bands were definitely more experimental for rock bands. They many of them didn't get airplay, although I think REM did pretty well in the decade. But these bands in this decade really paved the way for this genre to break out and become what rock music is from the 90s and onward. But I think that listening to a band like Pixies in particular, who are absolutely one of the most important, if not the most important of all of these bands, certainly one of, it's really interesting because I think that their sound was a lot more idiosyncratic and silly and even kind of punky than much of what alt-rock would come to be known as in the decades after this, which of course wasn't that long after, since this is right there at the tail end of the decade, but still a classic in the genre. And yeah, that's I'll let Stephen talk about it, I guess.
I think what I like about this album so much is it feels very eclectic. Like, obviously I knew what I was listening to going into this, and I've heard it before, but really sitting down with it and thinking about it more critically, it absolutely, you can tell where a lot of inspiration from later bands, where that kind of comes from this album. But even on this album itself, there's a lot of really different sounds, really different styles. At one point, it's very kind of like this new age surf rock, which obviously in the 80s there was a lot of like trying to rebrand or reestablish some of those older sounds in kind of this new electronic or updated format. And while I'm not saying that I think the Pixies were necessarily doing that, you get a lot of these interesting, like, at some point it's almost doo-wop, at some point it's surf rock, then it's very much their own thing in a lot of these tracks. And all of that kind of blends into this really awesome sound across the entire stretch of the album, and it's very easy to see how this inspired so many bands and so many different styles of music even after this. I'm thinking specifically around like grunge. You can definitely feel a lot of that in the Pixies, and where many of the grunge bands started to kind of get a sense of what that would become, and then just obviously alternative as an entire brand, and then as you mentioned, what ultimately just became rock. Honestly, pretty much everything eventually became labeled alternative, but at the time this was so unique, and that some of this got radio play is a credit not necessarily to the way that a lot of this could be tailored to mainstream, but one, I think what I will say is like what was interesting about the 80s is I do feel like there was a lot of creativity, a lot of change of direction, and there was a mainstream viewpoint and a mainstream hunger for those sorts of things that coming out of the 80s, a lot of what was played on the radio was actually much different than decades prior. So that this got radio play might not necessarily have been 100% a complete justification of what they did in their sound, but I think that their sound carried so much weight that it's just amazing to see like what they were able to do and where this was able to evolve in different styles and different mediums and different artists.
Well, and you think about too, like, so just 2 years later, Nevermind would come out, which was really the watershed moment. Like, this might be an incredibly important record, but it wasn't the gateway that broke alternative rock into the dominance that it had later. That was Nevermind. But, you know, I mean, Kurt Cobain always talked about how much he ripped off the Pixies. Maybe he didn't give himself enough credit, but it is definitely true that, like, whatever, I think people just got tired of hearing what rock became in the 80s because, I mean, God, I mean, what was the dominant rock of the 80s? Like glam metal, basically, which, yeah.
Yeah, or new wave.
Yeah, and the new wave, that's true. Well, I mean, and new wave evolved into a lot of other things too. But like, it depends on the time in the decade for sure. But like, yeah, it was definitely there was room for something else to take over, especially when you get to like the late 80s and then the very early 90s, like 1990 and stuff, where like you don't like if you listen to the radio from these times and the stuff that was popular, it's just like what the hell was even happening? It's so boring. And there was like something had to break. But I do think that what Nirvana brought to the sound after the Pixies was certainly more accessible than Pixies. At least some of it was. But Pixies really laid the groundwork for that pop appeal because this album in particular, I think, is such a perfect blend of like pop and of that pop side of the band and then the really like weird, quirky side of the band. And the two blend together so seamlessly to the point where some tracks can be kind of odd and slightly off-putting, but like super, super catchy and super, super hooky at the same time. And then you have songs that are just like perfect little pop tunes like Here Comes Your Man. But then I think of like a song like Hey, which is like yeah, it's really catchy, but God, that is a weird song when you compare it to any other pop rock for sure. And coming off of their album before this, which was Surfer Rosa, which is comparatively much more abrasive and much weirder too, I just think it's so cool that they were able to take all this stuff and blend it all together into this really, really perfect package. And plus, I think they were really smart about the way that they sequenced the record because a lot of these like pop anthems on the album, like Here Comes Your Man or Monkey Gone to Heaven, are placed right up against some of the strangest and most bizarre moments of the record. Like I think how right after Here Comes Your Man, there's Dead, which is like just the most abrasive song on the record. So they're really smart about that, guiding you through track to track, where it's like this album hooks you right from the beginning with Debaser, and then it hits you with Tame, which is, again, comparatively much, much more abrasive. But they do such a good job of keeping your attention and keeping you grabbed onto it, where it's like you're never really that put off by what they're doing here. It's always like it maintains that cohesion, it maintains that sense of accessibility because they're so smart about how they sequenced all of the songs.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the other thing that's really stands out to me, I already mentioned how, and you kind of mentioned it as well. There's a lot of variation in the style. Some of the tracks are definitely much more tailored to a very like clear pop focus, but all of it has this really interesting surrealness that I feel like you get, especially with some of these tracks like "Here Comes Your Man," "La La Love You." It's like it feels like it's harkening back to what the Beatles and what the Beach Boys did in the '60s, but for an '80s audience that then transformed into a '90s audience because they really were right on that cusp and absolutely inspired so much of what '90s rock became. And then you also get, as you mentioned, some tracks are very a lot more grunge, a lot dirtier. Uh, the vocal performances are very mixed. Some, you have lead vocals that are very pop on like "Here Comes Your Man," "Wave of Mutilation," and then some that just get very strange, some that get very screamy in a way, and all of that makes the whole album carry in such a beautiful way that you really are holding on to pretty much every note from beginning of this thing to the end because it is so varied. So it never gets boring, which a lot of the albums that we listen to can be very boring. I even think about a lot that I present to you, Lewis, can get very boring because they're so very specifically tailored in one way, and this is not. So it's very interesting to hear that as you go through the entire record.
Yeah, it's especially important for with an album or for an album with 15 tracks, right? Like, doesn't this have 15 tracks? Yeah, I don't want to get that wrong, but I'm pretty sure it does. But yeah, there's a lot of songs on this,
Yeah,
but they're
50.
short, they're punchy, and they transition so well. Like a song will just end and another one will just start, and it's just like you're always right there with them. Um, yeah, and something that I think is so great about these first two Pixies album that I think all four of the albums that Pixies put out before they broke up in 1991 are phenomenal. All four of them are so good. But something that only Surfer Rosa and Doolittle have that Bossa Nova and Tromplemont don't is Kim Deal's presence on here is so strong. She does get her own song with Silver, which certainly isn't as much of an anthem as like Gigantic was on Surfer Rosa, but her interplay with Frank Black, both of these vocalists are like definitely weird. They're both strange. Kim Deal will sing in these really high, kind of ghostly registers, especially with how they put the reverb on her voice behind Frank, who's usually shouting or just talking or singing slightly off key. And both of them are bizarre, but they work around each other in such creative and interesting ways all across this record. Like, not to mention her bass work, which her bass lines are just fire on like every song. Like, obviously, "Here Comes Your Man" has the most iconic bass line of all of these, but they're just so bubbly, and the production really makes that bass bouncy. It makes it really pop. It's got like such this, yeah, this bubbly, bouncy sound to it. It's just wonderful.
Yeah, and I wouldn't call it monotone, but it is that sort of style that she comes at the tracks with that even gives it that extra layer of spooky ghostliness, like she's not doing a lot of pitch variation or anything. She's like kind of in the background as this presence on a lot of tracks, and it just makes them so creepy to listen to in a way, on a lot of them, especially because he's doing these low registers or these like sing-song talk voices that get very low, contrasted to her very wispy kind of like out there performance on these, that it's such an experience for a lot of these tracks.
Yeah, and it brings that extra layer of energy too, just having that interplay on the record. I gotta say, like, another thing about this album is just like, and this has to do with flow as well. I think that like pretty much every song on this, well, yeah, every song on this is just amazing. But like, they do a good job of really making those true standouts that they knew that they had, like really really stand out. Like opening with the basser, and then getting like Here Comes Your Man, Monkey Gone to Heaven, and the way that they space these out with some of those weirder cuts, some of those less immediate cuts, makes these huge pop songs, and Hey, and then the closer Gouge Away. It makes them like really stand out. So it gives you those slight lulls. I mean, I don't think there are any lulls in this track list. I think every song is amazing, but some songs are definitely more immediate than others, and they do such a good job of like having those peaks and valleys throughout this record. And just another way that I think they really keep things interesting.
And not only that, just generally the production on this album is spot on from start to finish in pretty much every facet.
Yeah, for sure. Actually, and it's interesting because I think in comparison to Surferosa, this album has slightly more conventionally 80s production styles to it. I mean, barely. Both of these records do not fit with, I think, certainly like the rock production of that time or the pop production or anything. They were definitely doing their own thing, but this album definitely has a lot more reverb. The drums are a little bit more synthetic here, but it complements the sound. And I do think that the production is just amazing. Like I mentioned, the bass tone, which is incredible. But the guitar on this album sounds so colorful too. Like it's really rich. On Surferosa, it's really sharp and harsh, which gave that album a lot of grit. But this album, comparatively, is a lot. Well, it's softer in comparison, but again, that suits the poppier aesthetic of this record. And yeah, the drums just they have a lot of punch despite having the reverb on them. And it just, I don't know, the album has a lot of space. It doesn't sound as roomy or as like live and in the moment as Surferosa does. But it doesn't sound like so clean or so synthetic that it's just kind of like in one ear and out the other. I think they do a great job bringing space to the mix and color to this mix. And it's just yet another way in which this thing sounds so good.
Yeah, that's not even to pass on a lot of the lyrical quality here too, which I will say most of it is pretty weird, but there's a lot of imagery and iconography. If you actually follow what they're saying, which I think a lot of times it's like, I won't say that like the vocal performances are never dull, but they are kind of lulling in a way that's, I think, actually really good to listen to, very pleasing to listen to. But because they can be lulling like that, it's hard to pick up on a lot of what they're talking about. And there's a lot of very deep imagery track to track. There's not necessarily a cohesive story, but each of the individual tracks themselves have something to say. And I think that's something that gets absolutely carried on past this, because to this point, the norm was not to have something to say unless you were like literally a singer-songwriter, which there were a lot of. But taking rock and actually bringing it into a more mature, a deeper conversation, I think that this album does a lot of that as well, or at least advances a lot of that with a lot of the imagery here that then a lot of grunge bands specifically hold on to, and I'm thinking like Nirvana and others.
Well, it's great because they do it with so much like humor and quirkiness too. Like it's strange, and I think a lot of these songs, take Monkey Gone to Heaven, for example, which is a song about pollution and climate change. And just that title, Monkey Gone to Heaven, repeating the chorus over and over again. The monkey is like nature. They use like monkey to mean nature. And the way that he writes about pollution in this track, like, there was a guy, an underwater guy who controlled the sea and then got killed by 10 million pounds of sludge. It's just like, it's silly, but it's like, especially just the way that they're delivered, it's so profound, especially with this track, which has like that cello in it too. It's just like, it just really spices up the drama and the tension of this song. And then you have stuff like Hey, which is like basically just a song about how like two lovers get chained together eternally because they had sex. And it's like, but reading the lyrics of this is just fucking ridiculous, but it's so like, I don't know, I think it's amazing how, despite how goofy a lot of the wordplay is, like Wave of Mutilation about like, driving off a bridge to kill yourself. It's like, that's really dark. But then like you read it, it's just like, he's so silly. He's so goofy with everything. It doesn't feel like there's this big aura of self-seriousness. And yet like, you really can take it seriously. Like, it does end up being profound. It does end up speaking to you because it's all said in a way that you just don't usually hear. especially that combined with the sound of the record being like really off the beaten path, it's like it really, really perfectly captures you, and it's like it adds this aura of mystique to the lyrics too, which I just think is just great. And I will say that I think that what grunge, which of course comes off of 80s alt rock and other things, grunge and then alternative rock going into the 90s, like I think that what artists started to do is really get a lot more personal and explore a lot of darker emotions that people were not used to hearing in rock music, and certainly not in mainstream or poppier rock music. And that was kind of what defined that whole thing. And I don't think that Pixies quite did that, but they certainly there certainly is an amount of darkness to a lot of these songs where like you can see how bands could be inspired by that and take that even further, but just become a little bit more direct. There's no doubt that Pixies are still fairly abstract with things. I don't think they're quite as in your face as some of the later bands inspired by them would be, but you can definitely see where the lineage would be there.
Well, that seems pretty good. Should we wrap it up, or do you have more to say?
That's cool. Yeah, go ahead.
So I think this album is just absolutely incredible. A must listen for anyone, truly. I mean, this is such an inspirational album. It's not necessarily one that I feel like is it's still relatively recent in really the grand scheme of things, and I feel like it only will become bigger than itself as time goes on. I think people will continue to see how impactful this album is from start to finish. I just think it's, first of all, it's really breezy, honestly. I think it's like only a 40 something minute runtime, if that even.
It's
so
under 40.
It's very, yeah, it's very easy to listen to too. And there are, even if you're not necessarily into the more eclectic or the grungier stuff, there's a lot of really good pop albums that are sort of surreal, take a different twist on some of older styles. I think even that is worth a listen, if nothing else. So 100%, this album from me gets a 10. Absolutely recommend.
Yeah, of course it gets a 10 for me too. I think this actually is my favorite album of the 1980s, and at least to this point, it's not a decade I've explored as much as others. I don't tend to like it as much, but yeah, it's like I think that this remains okay. This is like the second best alt rock album ever. I guess I like OK Computer more, but whatever. They're the two best. But anyway, certainly of like this variety of the more straightforward, punchy, and more on the punk side of alternative rock, like, yeah, this is the best that there ever was. Like, I feel like, I don't know, there's just so many standout tracks too. It's such an easy album to get into. Like, taking it in on the whole can maybe be tricky because there are definitely weirder stuff on here, and there is a lot to take in. There's a lot of songs, but yeah, it is really short. It does fly by, and like there are those standout spotlight songs that like will hit you as soon as you hear them. And yeah, I just think that they write quite a few of just the best songs like ever made on this thing. Like, Monkey Gone to Heaven and Hey, Here Comes Your Man, stuff like that. It's just like undeniable classics. And yeah, so I recommend Pixies as a whole. I think their entire discography, if you don't talk about the albums they've been making this decade, which they don't count, if you go back and listen to those 4 original records, and I guess you could Come on Pilgrim, which was like their first EP, I guess too, but those first 4 albums, it's all a breezy listen, all of them, and they're all so great, so I recommend all of them. But yeah, of course, this is like one of the most essential records ever made, so you should definitely hear it. And a personal favorite of mine. And yeah, that's pretty much all we have to say about that. I think, should we move on to what you recommended to me, Steven?
Real quick, here's a little piece of my Wikipedia trivia, because
Ooh, boy.
I'm always looking at Wikipedia to remember track titles and stuff. So there were 3 singles that came off this album: Here Comes Your Man and Monkey Gone to Heaven in 1989. Then all the way in 1997, Debaser.
Yeah, that was probably after they'd gained notoriety from getting shouted out by like Kurt Cobain and stuff, and tons of other bands. Yeah. Also, I think "Where Is My Mind," their biggest song, arguably. Yeah, that is their biggest song because it was in Fight Club. That on Surfer Rosa was a single, but it wasn't a single until like 2003 or something. Again, probably just because Fight Club, So it was like, now we can sell it. That's a weird fucking song too, so I do not know how that's their most popular. If it was not in Fight Club, I don't think it would be. But anyway. Um, okay. Should we move on, though, to what you recommended?
Yes.
All right, go ahead.
So, Lewis, last time I recommended to you a film, The Princess Bride, 1987's The Princess Bride, directed by Rob Reiner. A comedy classic of the 80s. Really, for me, honestly, takes a very simple, very straightforward, and very, at this point, refined children's movie formula of the storybook tale. But specifically in the 80s, this had kind of a renaissance with things like Neverending Story and others, and puts a more adult, not necessarily edgy twist on the formula. So, Lewis, 1987's The Princess Bride.
Yeah, yeah, right off the bat, I mean, I agree with all of that. I think, like, God, it's just really funny. Like, that's where you have to, like, this is one of those movies similar to Monty Python and the Holy Grail, which for some reason always comes to mind when I think of this as well. Maybe because of the similar setting or something, I don't know. But both of these movies are like they've been quoted to death. Like it's those things where it's like there's parts in this movie, jokes in this movie that you hear and they're just not funny at all because you've heard everybody say them so much or reference them so much. But like that just kind of speaks to how funny of a movie it is. Like I think that there are just so many scenes in this that are like just hilarious. I like I won't even begin to call any out. There's like it's just like it's such a good comedy movie because it's one of those things where it's like you see a lot of comedy movies, especially of this variety, where they like they do have to have the story. There's like a romance to it or something, where it's like there always have to be bits where the movie takes itself seriously, or at least enough so you like really care about those characters or whatever. But this movie is just like tearing itself apart like all the time. Not to the same extent as Monty Python, but like it's not like that level of absurdity, but it's just somewhere in near there. Like the entire story of the film is framed around a frame story of like a grandfather telling it to some kid, or telling it to his grandson, telling it to his grandson who like kind of doesn't want to listen to it. And that makes it so that you're never like too suckered in to the actual story that's going on, where it really is just the silliness, the goofiness that ends up really standing out. And I really like comedies like that more than anything else, I think, where it's just like I could just watch that and it's just fucking silly. And this movie is really silly. You have like this cast of three, I don't know, were they pirates? Something like that. And they're trying to, kidnap the princess or whatever. And their dynamic is hilarious in the beginning of the movie. So many quotables there. And then once they all split off, it's just like every single character moment with these characters individually are just so funny and so memorable that it's like, yeah, I don't know. It's really fucking funny.
Yeah, and I think what I like about this movie so much is that, as I mentioned, it really does kind of take a spin on what was a really refined and defined formula for essentially children's storybook movies at this point in the 80s. And all of those movies, and obviously I can't harken back to what it was like to see them actually in the time, but they all have, especially if you watch them now, they all have this very specific style and this very specific hamminess to everything, the set design, the characters, the acting, all of that stuff. And what I like so much about this film is it takes all of that and absolutely uses it to satirize the formula. But as you mentioned, it never does it in such a way that I would call the film an action. Like if you compare this to a Holy Grail or an Airplane or something like that, which are absolutely 100% spoof films, this is not necessarily a spoof film of the genre. It really takes all of those components of the formula and spins them just enough to make it believable on its own, but also uses all of those elements to kind of shine a light on the silliness of the whole thing. And then on top of that, there's just some absolutely great comedic writing as well. And there's so much of this, even from the entire setup of the entire plot, and even the character names are just, all of it is with just this tinge of comedic interface that it's like, it's believable as a children's story, but you also know that it's all kind of playing on itself. And as you mentioned, there are so many quotable lines in this movie, and they get quoted all the time. But even going back, it's just, they're so good, and there's so many good scenes as well where all of those quotes take place that it really does stand the test of time to even all of that continual quoting and all of that stuff. I mean, just on this watch back, the scene where, you know, our Carrie Elways, he's going through, and at this point he's kind of quote unquote the Dread Pirate Roberts, and he's going through and he's having to basically beat all of these escalating missions, and it finally gets to the point where he kind of takes on the boss, and it's a game of wits. And he, you know, they're out talking each other and all of this stuff, and then it just turns out that it was like this game of wits where they were trying to figure out what the poison was, and just turned out he was immune to the poison the whole time, so it didn't matter. And those little components are just so interspersed in as well, because I think what also makes this movie so great is it's not just 100% like trying to hit you with laughs over and over and over again. There's enough of a spacing that those scenes really shine even brighter, because they are allowed to sort of breathe in the entirety of the runtime, which I really enjoy.
Yeah, it's definitely paced very well. And yeah, and I think that this movie, like one of the best things about it too, pacing wise, is that this movie really goes off the rails like in the last act, which like there were a lot of funny scenes before then, but there was a lot of spacing. You had time to breathe. But in this final act where like everything's coming together and everybody's stories are wrapping up, and they actually like, there's like a castle storming kind of thing. Like, it is just bonkers. They throw so much of the silliest gags that they have like right there, then and there, and it is just fantastic. A lot of physical humor in this too. It's like even the acting performances are like not quite that great, which kind of just adds to the sense that like nobody's really taking this too seriously. Like, there's a story going on, and it's not just, you know, a complete deconstruction. There is a real like kind of, you know, princess story, pirate story, whatever. There's that story going on, but everybody's like very tongue-in-cheek about the whole thing, and I actually appreciate that quite a bit. Like, that's on every level too. Like even in the frame story, it's just I think that I love the fact that it's like, you know, you're never really supposed to be like 100% taking this seriously, but they don't just go completely off the rails. It's like if you were a kid, I feel like if you were a kid and you watched this, you would just see it as like a fantasy movie with like a couple jokes in it. Like and that's kind of cool actually, because it does actually operate as that. It does kind of work as that, but it's like, it's, again, there's this layer of irony or silliness or insincerity to it, just a tiny bit in there that makes the whole thing so much more enjoyable.
I just want to call out, and we had no idea that this was happening between recording sessions, but actually just a few days ago, the entire cast got together and they did essentially like a Q&A and a screen read. It was hosted, I think, by Patton Oswalt, and it was for the benefit of some political organization or something. But anyway, it just seemed kind of crazy to me that it just so happened that we had coincidence where only a few days ago they all got together to do some line reads.
Yeah, that's cool. I'll have to check that out. Oh, I will. So I will say this about this movie, and this is probably where I think some of my reservations with it are, and I do like this movie a lot, so it's nothing huge. I I do feel like the movie is a little bit slow going in the beginning. It's not like it's a slow movie, but I think it takes a little bit to really become great. It is a little bit awkward in some of the earlier scenes, especially with some of the editing is a little bit awkward. And I think the character dynamics start to really get off their feet probably past like the boating scene once they actually get to the cliffs, which isn't that far into the movie, but it did put me off a tad. And I also think, even though I did mention the frame story as a way for the film to show to like not get you 100% invested, which I do think works okay, I also think it's kind of really unnecessary. The way that these scenes of the grandfather reading the story are like paced throughout the movie is kind of weird. It's not They're always just placed at weird points where I don't really understand why. And they don't really do anything creative with it. There's only like one part where they play around a little bit with the third wall, with it being a frame story, and it's when it's in the eel scene. But other than that, I kind of just felt like there was no need for that to be there, and it is a little bit weird. Although there is one really great joke with it later in the film. I still just feel like that was probably not necessary. I don't really see why you needed to do that, because it wasn't like they framed it as, you know, the story you were watching was like the way that the grandfather was telling it. So you really could have just had that not be there, and I don't think it would have made much of a difference. But I do understand at the same time that, like, you know, Neverending Story and stuff, like, were also framed a similar way, like reading a book and then the stuff happens. So maybe it's just to fall in line more with the trope, but I just didn't see the point.
You did call out the acting, and I did want to mention that as well. I agree. It's like none of the acting here is that great, but all of it just plays into the larger narrative, really. And I think you mentioned it as well. But like specifically, I'm thinking about Andre the Giant. Obviously, he was not an actor, although wrestling is acting. Hot take, but
Hot take, yeah. No one knows that.
But like even his acting in this is just like all fits in so perfectly. And I think specifically, like one scene I want to call out is when Billy Crystal shows up, who Billy Crystal and Rob Reiner, especially in the 80s and into the 90s, worked together a ton on a ton of different projects. And he's hamming it up so much in a very specific way that is very clearly all Reiner direction. And you can feel Rob Reiner's direction throughout the whole, like throughout every component of this, obviously. But even that to me just was like one little nod that obviously he was telling these actors to just like completely go for it. Like, you know, this is not something that where they need to be at their best. All of it kind of plays into a very specific style that it just captured so well. And it's interesting because I feel like what's the oddest component to me of this film is it has become a cult classic, and understandably so. I mean, as an entity, it absolutely holds up on its own. It's incredibly funny. It's an incredibly charming story. Every component of it is just, it makes sense that it's become what it is. But it really, really is, I mean, 100% all going into those tropes of that very clear 1980s storybook. And so while those have not necessarily washed away completely, they're absolutely not as prevalent or as well received or regarded anymore in history. But this is still such a powerful comedic story that it has able to kind of like transform into its own thing. And I think what really defines what I feel like the best satire is that if people can look at your piece of media and say everything else was actually ripping off of you, then you have created an incredibly good satire. And I feel like with The Princess Bride, there is probably a non-zero portion of people out there who probably do see that when they look at Princess Bride versus others. And that's just a testament to the way that they were able to really hone in on those tropes and hone in on every single component of what that is.
Yeah, because I don't think it relies on reference or context to be funny and good, you know? Like, you can very easily watch this on its own, and it's, like, just really funny. The jokes just, like, they all stand up. I don't, while there are definitely references to tropes and such, it's not, like, putting that front and center, like, that's what we're making fun of. It's like, no, it's just really funny. The writing is just really good. When you compare it to, like, a lot of spoof movies where there will be jokes, or especially like the really bad ones. There will be jokes that are just completely and utterly dependent on you having seen whatever's being referenced, and it wouldn't be funny otherwise. And this is just not like that at all. It's just the writing is just it really holds up. It's so funny, and the character dynamics are so good that you don't need to know all of that background.
So I think I've kind of said my piece on this. Is there anything else?
No, I'm cool to wrap it up. Yeah. Yeah. So I would definitely say this is definitely a very great comedy. And it is a cult classic, and it does get quoted all the time, and that only stands to show like how funny it is. Again, I think it's just yeah, I think it's just it's a very breezy movie too. It feels even shorter than it is. It's not particularly long, but it feels even shorter. The pacing is just very strong, especially as the movie continues along. It just really picks up, and yeah, I would probably give it like an 8, and definitely recommend it too. Is it one of the best comedies of the 1980s? Yeah, probably. I wouldn't really know, but probably, yeah. Yeah, for sure.
And I just really adore this movie. I'd go ahead and give it a 9. It's not necessarily perfect, and I don't think, but I do think it absolutely holds up as one of the greatest comedies, just period. At least in the top 100 easily, and then maybe even up from there. Especially for me, all of the jokes just hit so well, and that's really the most important part of a comedy. Even having seen this 100 times, just like Monty Python, when we talked about that, the Holy Grail, even going back to it, it's still funny, even knowing exactly what it is. And that's really a testament to the writing. And I talked about all the other components as well, but really at the end of the day, the most important part of a comedy is its writing. And the writing here is just superb. And I would 100% recommend it. It's not very that long either. It's pretty easily accessible. It's really has become a cult classic, so I would be surprised if you haven't seen it at this point, but if you haven't, I definitely recommend it for a watch.
Okay. And should we move on to recommendations?
Yes, let's.
Awesome. Okay, so I'll go first. So, Stephen, well, no theme next week, in case that wasn't obvious. Stephen, I'm going to recommend to you the film The Blair Witch Project. The Blair Witch Project is a 1999 found footage horror film. It was one of the most, well, certainly one of the most famous found footage films. One of the first ones that most people ever heard of or saw. There were ones before it, but not that a ton of people know about. And of course, like a big, huge phenomenon, because had one of the first major viral marketing campaigns of really anything, but especially of movies. And yeah, we'll talk about it next time.
And Lewis, I am going to recommend to you something that I'm sure we will revisit someday. Not this one specifically, but something in this series I 100% expect will come up at some point. I'm going to recommend to you the 1997 film The Lost World: Jurassic Park. More colloquially known,
You'll get it.
Never mind. Anyway, you probably know it as Jurassic Park 2. Most people call it Jurassic Park 2, but the official title is The Lost World: Jurassic Park, as dumb as that is. This was a 1997 movie, as I mentioned. This one was again directed by Steven Spielberg, which other ones were eventually not. And this one was still based on a Michael Crichton book, which other ones were eventually not. As I mentioned, we probably will take a look at other things in this series at some point. I 100% expect that, but I thought for a non-theme, we would take a look at The Lost World: Jurassic Park.
Well, we do always have re-rec coming down the pipe at some point, so always an opening. But yeah. Okay, sweet. Well, as always, everybody, I have to say, check us out on CastBox. Try to put these episodes up as soon as they come out. That's always the goal. Thanks for watching, as always. Do we have anything else to say?
No, just as you mentioned, everyone, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening wherever you're listening, whether that be on CastBox or here live with us. on YouTube. Again, if you are listening on Castbox, we do stream these live on YouTube at some sort of a cadence, which is 2 weeks as we try, but not always 2 weeks. You should get a notification if you subscribe to Casting 404 when we go live. You can join in with us on the live chat. We even chat in our live chat sometimes, so we might even call you out. Who knows?
Yeah, you'll get a call out.
A shout out.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's pretty much that. But yeah, everyone, again, just thanks everybody. And with that, those were our thoughts. Those were our recommendations. Get wrecked.